The Vietnam War was one of the most controversial conflicts in modern history. In today's video, we are going to look at the key events that took place during this protracted and bloody conflict, which pitted the communist North against the non-communist South. And if you like learning about significant historical events, then stay tuned for more content. Let us start our Vietnam War timeline with a brief overview of how the French colony became involved with the US in the first place. In the late 19th century, France established a colonial empire in the region of Southeast Asia known as Indochina, which consisted of present-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. France ruled over its colonial subjects in Vietnam quite harshly, and this led to several rebellions over the years. However, none of these revolts were successful, and the Vietnamese people lived under French rule until World War II. During the Second World War, the Japanese army invaded and occupied French Indochina. After the war, France attempted to reassert its authority over the region, but various nationalist movements had emerged which sought independence from the French. The First Indochina War began in 1946 when the Viet Minh, a communist-led coalition of Vietnamese nationalists, launched a surprise attack on the French colonial forces. Despite being outnumbered, the Viet Minh were able to hold their ground, and they gained international support through acts of defiance such as the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This battle resulted in the capture of a heavily fortified French base, and it demonstrated the military superiority of the Viet Minh. As a result, the French were forced to withdraw from Vietnam, and the Geneva Accords temporarily divided the country along the 17th parallel, with the Communists in control of the North and the US-backed regime of Ngo Dinh Diem in control of the South. It was hoped that a unified and democratic Vietnam would emerge after 2 years. But this never happened, and instead we got the Vietnam War. Ngo Dinh Diem's regime in South Vietnam was far from perfect, and he quickly turned his back on any promises of democracy and free elections. He instead established a dictatorship, and he alienated many of his potential supporters by his preferential treatment of the landowning class and Buddhist persecution. As a consequence, a communist-led guerrilla movement known as the Viet Cong began to gain momentum in the South. By 1960, the US government believed that the spread of communism in Vietnam was a threat to its national security, and so it began providing large amounts of financial and military aid to the South Vietnamese regime. Under President John F. Kennedy, this policy of containing communism became known as the Flexible Response Policy. In essence, it meant that the US was prepared to use conventional military force to counter the communist threat, but the use of such force would be a last resort. In August 1963, a group of South Vietnamese majors assassinated Diem in a coup d'etat, and his regime was replaced by a military coup. However, the Viet Cong continued to wage war against the new regime, and by 1964, the US government felt compelled to intervene directly. On August 2nd and 4th, 1964, two US destroyers, the Maddox and the Turner Joy, were allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Maddox had been conducting a surveillance mission in the area, and it may well have been the target of the North Vietnamese. However, the second reported attack on the Turner Joy seems to have been fabricated. The North Vietnamese certainly didn't launch a second attack. In fact, they probably didn't even carry out the first one. What we have here is an example of self-imposed cognitive dissonance on behalf of the US government, who were determined to find a reason to get involved in Vietnam. On August, the US Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which effectively gave President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to deploy American troops to Vietnam and to use force if necessary. And within a month, 200,000 American soldiers had entered the country. Initially, Johnson's strategy was to bomb North Vietnam into submission and to support the South Vietnamese in the south. However, it soon became apparent that neither of these strategies would work. Bombing the North didn't break the will of the Vietnamese people, and America's conventional military tactics were no match for the decentralized guerrilla army of the Viet Cong. By 1966, the Tet Offensive had begun. This offensive was a coordinated series of surprise attacks launched by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army against sites throughout South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive was not a military victory for the Communists, but it undermined public support for the war in America. Up until the Tet Offensive, the US government had insisted that the war was almost over. "We're winning," they said. But the Tet Offensive proved to be a propaganda victory for the Communists, because it showed that the war was far from over. In fact, it would get much worse. At its peak in 1967 and 1968, there were around 540,000 American troops fighting in Vietnam. But despite their numbers, they were unable to make any significant progress against the Viet Cong. Throughout 1967, various anti-war protests took place across America. But it wasn't until Martin Luther King Jr. entered the fray that the war began to turn against Johnson. King was a prominent civil rights activist, and he was troubled by the thousands of African Americans who were being killed in Vietnam for a war that was deeply unpopular at home. In April 1967, he delivered his famous speech, "Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence." In it, he condemned both the war and American militarism more generally. He also drew parallels between the struggle for civil rights in America and the Vietnamese struggle for independence. In the speech, King said, "We have been repeatedly disappointed by the fact that our government has refused to recognize the justness of the struggle of the African people against colonialism and neocolonialism in Africa and in Asia. We have seen our nation's commitment to freedom and equality turn in our own land to oppression and discrimination. We have seen our tax dollars and our young men sent to fight in a war that has taken the lives of almost 40,000 of our fellow Americans, and for what?" Following this speech, Johnson decided not to seek re-election in 1968, and his place as Democratic Party candidate was taken by Hubert Humphrey, who supported the war. However, the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, ran on an anti-war platform, and he promised to end the conflict in Vietnam. In the election, Nixon won the popular vote by the smallest margin in post-war American history. Upon taking office, he announced a policy known as Vietnamization, which aimed to end America's involvement in the conflict by gradually withdrawing its troops and replacing them with South Vietnamese soldiers. Nixon also ordered the expansion of the war into neighboring Cambodia and Laos in an attempt to cut off North Vietnamese supply lines. This led to further anti-war protests on the streets of America. However, by 1969, the number of American troops in Vietnam had been reduced by half, and by 1973, they were all withdrawn. The Vietnam War officially ended on April 30, 1975, with the fall of Saigon. By this point, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong had entered the city, and the South Vietnamese president, Diem Van Minh, surrendered to them. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and efforts were made to unify the two halves of the country. And so that was the Vietnam War in a nutshell. A protracted and controversial conflict that ultimately resulted in the defeat of the United States and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. But what was the legacy of the Vietnam War? While in terms of the Vietnamese people, it's difficult to say whether they consider the war a positive or negative event. On the one hand, the war resulted in the unification of their country and the establishment of a communist regime which has brought about greater economic equality. On the other hand, the war caused immense devastation and loss of life, and the country is still dealing with the physical and psychological effects of the conflict today. As for the United States, the war was a clear defeat. It damaged the country's economy and prestige, and it left a deep psychological wound that has never fully healed. There is perhaps no better testament to the trauma of the Vietnam War than the thousands of Americans who fled to Canada to avoid the draft. Did you know that it is estimated that over 250,000 Americans moved to Canada during the Vietnam War? Many of them were young men who did not want to participate in the conflict. They were known locally as Maple Traitors, although this nickname was never very popular. Some of the deserters were given political asylum, while others simply disappeared into Canadian society. At the time, Canada was a very different country than it is today, and many of these Americans found greater social and economic opportunities in their adopted homeland. Canada's Prime Minister at the time, Lester B. Pearson, famously said, "If they came here illegally, they should stay here legally." However, not all Canadians shared this view. Some felt that the deserters were avoiding their responsibilities and that they should be sent back to America. Nevertheless, most of the Americans who fled to Canada were able to live out the remainder of their lives in peace. So there you have it, a very brief overview of the Vietnam War. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more content. Thanks for watching.